Morning, everybody. Thanks for attending. We're just waiting a couple more minutes to allow some of the latecomers to join, and we'll start in about a minute or so. Thank you. Yeah, good morning, everybody. Let's get started. I think we've waited a couple of minutes to let people join. But yeah, thanks very much for joining our webinar today on using AI to save time, especially to save time in terms of information management. This morning, the presenters are myself, JP from Advance, and Kevin from M-Files. We both have a history of over 10 years in the IT industry, helping organisations manage their information and share their content with their people within their businesses and also external parties. Thanks, Kevin. I was clicking to move, but I forgot you're presenting.
All good, mate.
Yeah.
Everyone.
All right, so let's have a look at the agenda today. We're going to talk briefly about the Information Management Challenge, how we got here, and why it's just not that simple to solve the problem with just throwing AI at a problem of unstructured data, which a lot of us have, and then how AI can help us, but why we need that solid foundation of I think a really good structure for AI. And then finally, we're going to have a look at how we can implement that foundation for AI. We're living in the world of the digital scavenger hunt. I'm not sure about you, but I've certainly experienced this where I'm in a meeting with a client and there's 5 or 10 people on the call, and someone says, "Oh, remember that statement of work we discussed a couple of weeks ago that someone shared in the meeting?" And it's like, where is it? And where's the latest one? Was it shared by email? Was it shared directly in the Teams chat? Or was it shared through a OneDrive link or something like that? I think the reason we've gotten to that is because the systems and tools we use are really optimized for saving and sharing. They're not optimized for retrieval. So what happens is it's really easy for someone to save a file or a document, get it off their plate, and then share it. But then what happens when another person needs to find it, it's a far bigger challenge. Now, we've had a look. There's a lot of industry information to support that this is a significant problem. In fact, we've had a look at some articles which they stipulate that it's up to 25% of someone's day can be spent looking for information, or indeed doing what they call work about work, which is finding and storing, collating information and updating systems and processes without actually adding much value to that. One of the things that I thought was quite interesting was that the growth of the enterprise search market doesn't look like it's slowing down at all. It's 10% per annum. And I think there's two main drivers to that, or two main reasons. One, we're creating more and more content. We're using AI to create more and more content. And secondly, finding it is also a challenge. And so AI, enterprise search together doesn't really just solve this problem. And I think part of the reason is the way we're structuring. Traditionally, we're structuring our content and data. So what most companies are doing is they're taking the old manual way of filing or storing information, which is paper-based. So we've got a piece of paper, a manila folder, filing cabinet, and they've just taken that paradigm and moved it to the digital world. And there's a couple of problems with that. We're storing just so much more information than we used to, and finding it is becoming more difficult, and the way it's being stored is posing challenges. We really haven't leveraged the advantages of having stuff stored digitally. That's a word I struggle with, Kevin, so I'm not going to say it too often. So if we could move on to the next slide. I think the key thing is the traditional folder structure that a lot of people have on their network. This quote there says, it doesn't live in a tree. Information doesn't live in a tree. It lives in the web. I think you need to also think about, us as humans, our brains. Our brains are not structured like folders. They are structured like a web. Things are just so totally unrelated, but yet they're related. And you don't get that if you have a folder structure where you have a piece of information that's related to something else by something that's not in that kind of structure. I hope I haven't lost you all. Anyway, Kevin, let's move on.
So what we're gonna talk about today is taking back control of managing your information. So if you think about it, right, the average life cycle of a document, there's probably about 19 copies of it within its life cycle. And typically what happens when you're managing information in this kind of folder-based system is you'll probably get scenarios where you would experience some of these pains. And so JP, what are the challenges that come up most often when you talk to your customers about their information management challenges?
Well, I think it's primarily twofold. It is where can I find it and where do I store it? So often what happens is you've got a document. Is it sales or is it marketing? Or it's a project related document. Does it go against the project, the customer, or the type of work? So I think they're very closely tied, how you store something and how you find it.
Yep.
The other one also is the version control. I think we've often gone in to work with new customers and they've said to us, how we share information as an example, when we're creating a tender document, there's sometimes 17 revisions and we're attaching it to emails. And then it's too big to attach to emails. That's what we're finding.
Yeah. So you could even say that this is the kind of problem we're trying to solve when we talk about enterprise search. But the reason why we actually have this problem is not from the searching, but it's actually from the saving, which is this bit here, right? So where does it go, which folder? That's the dilemma that a lot of people actually have. If you're using a folder-based system, you need to kind of make a judgment on where you're going to save that, and how it's going to be accessed by the people is kind of secondary to that. And that's the problem, why we have this problem. It's also the reason why we have all these problems, because these problems actually are a cascading consequence of that. Version control and who's made changes. And what we're actually going to do now is help you visualize what that looks like. So let's look at a traditional folder structure. This is a very simplified version of it because most organizations don't just have one network drive, they'll probably have multiple. And if you think about modern work today, you will have also your desktop, SharePoint, OneDrive, maybe Dropbox or Google Drive or some other system. We know a lot of smaller consulting firms use these kind of freemium cloud services to share data in and out of the organization. So you can see here there's a plethora of different places that you could store information. And then last but not least, my favorite one, everyone's favorite document management system, Outlook. So there's many places in which that information could be stored. But let's look now at a more simplified version of that. Let's pretend now, JP, that you're Andy, and you want to save a sales proposal related to a customer project from 2023 with ESTT. So if you were Andy, JP, where would you store that document? Which folder would you store it in, that sales proposal?
Well, I know what I used to do. You know,
Yep.
when I was Andy previously, I used to store it in my own personal drive or folder.
Yep.
And then when I felt it was ready, I'd move it to the customer folder. And
so you're telling me you would store it, you'd probably store it there.
yeah.
Yep. Then you'd move it there.
Yes, but here's the problem. Partway through, I'm going to need some help from a subject matter expert. Let's say Matt. I'm going to ask him. So how do I get him to help me when it's in my local drive?
Yep. So these are the dilemmas that we actually face because technically there's actually there's no wrong answer, right? You could save it in these places like the sales folder or the 2023 subfolder or the project folder and so on. But
I got to tell you a story.
Where we start having some of these challenges is what we were talking about before in the previous slide, right? So I'm Andy and I save into my folder there, but then what happens is I will then copy that so that the customer management team can look at that as well. So we'll copy the document. As soon as we've copied it, we've actually started creating duplication. This is where we start getting version control issues because the problem is if Andy's copied that document into here, and then Andy then has to update the proposal for whatever reason, Andy probably isn't going to update the version that was copied there, nor is he going to even be aware that there's even a copy in the sales folder for 2023. So these are some of the problems that we get. And as soon as you start copying documents, you then break what we call the chain of custody. So then you break the audit trail or the auditability of that information. But then last but not least, permissions. Because a lot of organizations manage permissions based on this kind of folder structure, which works fine in principle. But the problem is once you start copying documents from one place to another, you actually break that permissions model. And when we start talking about using generative AI to help us with enterprise search, which is kind of the fun part of the presentation today, you'll start seeing why this becomes an even greater problem. And I think, JP, you guys have been selling M-Files now and using M-Files since 2008 or thereabouts. Would you like to share your story about that?
Look, what you've got in front there, what you're presenting is exactly what triggered us to look at a solution like M-Files. In fact, we had this really defined structure. We had to come up with standards because at the time we'd won some projects and we'd nearly doubled the size of our team. And a larger consulting firm we were working with, they had set these standards around folder structures. But we were finding that people were dragging and dropping and we were losing information and we wanted stuff to appear in multiple places. And so I went out on the web and found M-Files and I was not looking to be a reseller at all. I just said, no, I kept saying, no, I'm not interested in selling your software. I need to solve this problem. But then when we started using it, it's now the first thing I install when I've set up a new PC or laptop, because as soon as I've done it, I can just find whatever I need. So I'm convinced, but let's keep going, Kevin. Yeah, so I tried using this Google appliance. I don't know if people know about it. Back in 2008, I had gotten a trial of it. And the big problem was it just found way too much information. So I'd search for a license agreement, but I couldn't search for license agreement and limit it to license agreement in the last 6 months or a customer. And so interestingly, Google dropped it in 2009. I think a lot of other people were having the same kind of situation where you'd search all your documents in your network folder and you just find too much information. And I can see a parallel with AI doing the same kind of thing.
Absolutely.
I mean, yeah.
Yep. And that's that curation element, right? That we're going to talk about in a moment. So we've kind of established now that managing information in this kind of folder tree or folder structure can be a challenge, but thankfully there's actually a better way to do that. And imagine, like right now, being able to find information just like you would finding something to stream or watch or listen to using, you know, one of your favorite streaming platforms. And all of these streaming platforms are actually managing information, not with folders, but with metadata. And so all they're doing is they're taking the media file and they're just tagging it. Who's the artist? What playlist is it in? What genre is it? When was it released? The album? All that kind of information. That's actually how they're managing information. So it kind of makes sense to manage information that way, because you can see now that this movie could be connected to many different things, like it could be part of a series, or could be part of a specific genre, or maybe it won an Oscar award or something like that. So if it kind of makes sense for us to do that in things that we use at home, why aren't we doing that with our business content? And so with mFiles, we've got the same kind of thing. It's called a dynamic view, and we manage information based on what it is as opposed to where it is. So if we think about that scenario we had before with Andy's sales proposal for ESTT from 2023, that is just metadata. That just describes what the document is. And by just adding the metadata to the document, we can actually automate the management of that information. So anything from storing it to categorizing it to being able to see in a structured way, permissions, even the workflow. All of those things can be automated just by adding that extra little bit of business context. So with that metadata, it allows us now to see that document in all of these different locations. And we don't have to have that dilemma anymore of where should I save this into, or have the dilemma of where is it or what the latest version is, because we only have one copy of the document and it's visible to everyone who's got access to it in the way that they want. And JP, I think you've got another story that you'd like to tell us about another customer, one of your customers.
Yeah, we had a interesting situation where that structure was in place with an organisation that's in the construction industry, and they tend to be very project oriented, and they have some quite large projects that they wanted each project manager to have access to project documentation, but not financial information relating to the project. And so that caused a bit of a problem, because they had all these folders and then they had these subfolders for financials, and the network admins had spent months, if not years, literally trying to make it secure enough but yet free enough for people to see the information that they needed to. And I think when our consultants got there, it was something like a day or two and that problem went away. And that's because of the ability to share things or secure things based on what they are as opposed to where they are. It's a totally different paradigm. And I think it really also relates so much to Gen AI or AI, because if you can imagine you've got an AI bot that's trawling all this information, should it really be allowed to look at certain things? Perhaps not. And I think that this is going to really pose a massive challenge for people. And also, what is really scary, Kevin, is that business owners won't know what the AI bot, the AI system is actually able to see and find.
Yeah, absolutely. So with mFiles, how it works, you've got the file itself. So it can be any document. Could be a drawing, could be a spreadsheet, presentation, Word document, PDF, email, it doesn't matter. Then we add the business context, which is the metadata, and that allows us to see it in the dynamic views. The permissions are automated, the workflow is automated, sharing it can also be automated. all of that information can be automated just by adding that extra business context. So what we're going to do now is talk about some, how do we actually use this metadata, and why is it important when we're considering things like, for example, implementing generative AI for enterprise search. So you might see, for example, Copilot for M365 as an example of that. And what we're really trying to do is trying to give you a bit of an understanding on what are the three kind of C's or three things to consider before you implement those types of systems so that you can get the maximum kind of value out of those investments. So in the conversations I've been having with customers regarding generative AI on this topic of enterprise search, here are the three key takeaways so far. The first one being that generative AI has a lot of tangible benefits, but in order for those benefits to be realized, you need a solid information management foundation. In fact, in conversations I've been having with CIOs who were early adopters of Copilot for M365, they told me that they've actually scaled back their deployment because it made them realize that they need to get their information management structure right. And they now have some BAs working on projects to assess that situation. But with the right information management system in place, with alignment from your business strategy, there is a clear path to unlock the potential of generative AI. The dream is that you can just enable this for enterprise search and as a feature and just get started. However, there are some salient considerations to make before we go full steam ahead. Before we jump into that, I'll just give you a quick primer. So when we refer to generative AI applications, we're referring specifically to applications that generate text such as ChatGPT, Copilot, Gemini, and even mFilezano. So mFiles does have its own generative AI solution built into the product. But in its simplest form, and what most people have been exposed to, you can use it to generate image, video, or text. But let's just focus on the text generation part. And so this is how it works in the free versions. You ask a question, you get your answer back. It gets the answer back from what we call the large language model or the LLM. This LLM is a static learned set of information that is used by the generative AI application to provide context and general knowledge to then provide a response back to you. Now, one key thing to consider here is that it's actually not searching the internet to get your answer. This is a static set of information. And so when you ask a question, it's asking that static set of information and then coming back to you with the answer. However, the information contained within this large language model, that does contain information from the internet. Where it gets a bit more complex is when we try and use these tools for things like, for example, enterprise-wide search. And the reason why it's more complex is because we need to use this technique called RAG, which is retrieval augmented generation. And so there are actually two inputs now, your inquiry or your prompt. And when you create your inquiry or your prompt, you need to make sure that you're asking the question with the right kind of context so it understands what you're asking about and what information you need. And with that context, what it tries to do, once it's got that understanding of your context, it then takes your information from your systems and it tries to kind of refine the data in context to your question. So obviously it's not going to bring back all of your data to get your answer. It's only going to retrieve a small amount of your documents to then try and process it through here to give you back an answer. And that context is really important. And we're going to show you why that is now. So in a simple kind of scenario, if we ask this question, what is the SLA penalty for delayed response? You should be able to get this answer back. But the challenge is actually making sure that we are managing our data with the right context so we can get this answer back really easily. So if you don't manage your data with the right context, what actually happens is you ask your question and the answer you get will be based on the wrong company, or the wrong products, or the wrong type of information, because that's email now. Permissions, so you might be getting answers to questions that you shouldn't actually know the answers to. And even things like, for example, old versions, expired versions, archived versions, and so on. So this is what happens when you're not managing information with the right context. And for most organizations, they're not even doing that because they're just dumping information into folders. The other challenge is making sure that we engineer what we call the perfect prompt. So even this question doesn't have enough context. And one of the steepest learning curves for anyone who's used generative AI to do searching or getting insights to information, one of the challenges is actually creating the perfect prompt because it's not normal, doesn't feel natural to kind of ask questions in this way. So what ends up happening is you ask that question, you go, oh, I forgot to mention that it's actually for the customer ESTT, or hang on a second, the answer you got is referencing the wrong version of the document from the previous year. I want the answer from 2024. And don't use the other version of the document, use the one that's called final in the file name, and don't use the draft from Joe. So these are some of the challenges that we have when we don't manage information with context. So context is king, because even if you had the perfect prompt, it would still fail if we aren't managing our information in the right kind of way. So those are the three kind of key challenges: the lack of context, then also information security. Organizations these days can't rely on the premise of information security by obscurity, and then also garbage in, garbage out. So if we can't provide a curated set of data for the generative AI application to use, we will inevitably end up with rubbish answers. So these challenges can be solved with what we refer to as the 3 Cs. Having these in place will enable your organizations to be what I would like to call future ready. And so we've got connectivity, which is enriching the metadata of your files by connecting them with context from your master data systems. We've got confidentiality, making sure that the right permissions are applied with as much automation as possible, and curation, which is ensuring that only the latest and most up-to-date material is accessed, which can be achieved by automating your information governance so it happens within the flow of work. And what we're going to do now is jump into each one of these topics in more detail to help you kind of understand why they're important and what are some things that you could do practically to kind of get to achieving the 3 Cs. So let's look at connectivity in more detail. So with connectivity, we want to make sure that information has rich context with metadata from your master data systems, and having your content stored in the right context provides helpers for generative AI to provide the most contextually relevant answers. The other thing is that the premise of enterprise search assumes that all data sources are available to search across. Therefore, it is essential to have information aggregated in a unified system. It's not practical to assume all content will be stored in the same system, so your system should be able to manage content and be repository neutral. And we also want to make sure that connected systems need to still obey the permissions models. And content automation needs to be implemented to avoid the chances of out-of-date content being used for answers.
Hey, Kevin.
Yep.
Oh, sorry. Going back there, one of the things I thought about was, as you said, those connected systems have to obey the same security model. I think that can be a big challenge. As an example, if you're using a connection to an ERP system and you don't have the correct security integration there, we've come across that issue before.
Yep. It's really important because once you start doing this enterprise search thing, you want to also make sure that you're not exposing things that previously weren't exposed because it was kind of done at an application layer.
Yeah.
And so when we think about connectivity and doing this practically, in M365, for example, if you wanted to connect your documents to information from your ERP or your CRM system, you would rely on staff diligence and manual process which typically has a low compliance rate as people forget that they need to do it. Whereas if you're using metadata, you would be able to automatically fill in the project ID when specifying the project the document is for. So as soon as we say, hey, this document's for this project, that project ID would be added automatically within the flow of work.
That's a bit out of date, isn't it, Kevin? Because we now have the ability to automatically create the metadata using AI. Sorry to steal your thunder, but that's,
yes,
I'm really excited
about it. It is possible to do that. But, even if we think about it from a basic level, these are things that these are the reasons why it's important to use metadata to manage information, to get that connectivity. The next topic is confidentiality, which is what I discussed earlier, that organizations can no longer manage information on the premise of information security by obscurity. And the confidentiality aspect is really important to consider, and partly the reason why many organizations are still cautious with implementing these projects for information management and knowledge management. Many organizations I've spoken to had previously given up on trying to manage information securely internally to their organization and had instead tried to defend the perimeter by improving their cybersecurity posture by using data loss prevention solutions. So, first and foremost, I'm not disputing the value of these applications. However, I think personally that preventing staff from accessing information they shouldn't be accessing in the first place would make these systems more robust. And one of my favorite sayings is, once the toothpaste is out of the tube, you can't put it back in the tube again. So let's move on to some example questions that staff may ask and get answers to if you don't have robust information management mechanisms in place. So if we're using generative AI to help us with enterprise search, it does make it much easier now to ask these types of questions and get answers back.
Yeah, some of those you don't want the wrong people knowing.
No, but I mean, you've had customers, JP, where you've gone and enabled some basic kind of connected search, and some of the results that were yielded were not desirable.
Yeah, we had people say turn it off, really turn it off now because too much information was coming out. The other thing that we found, which is quite interesting, is that sometimes in often not-for-profits or government type agencies, there will be people acting in a role. So they may be acting in a particular role. And then when they went back to their normal role, they inherited all the permissions for all the future documents. And that was a real concern. And so that's something also to be aware of, is sometimes it's a bit like what you said about once it's out of the toothpaste, toothpaste is out of the what's it called?
The tube.
The tube. I was thinking jar. I'm thinking toothpaste not in the jar. Once it's out of the tube, you can't put it back. But you've got to be careful. We've discovered this, that sometimes when people are acting in a role, they're being given permission sets, and then when they're left that, they still keep that permission set.
Yep, and that could be quite a challenge. Absolutely. Yeah, so before Gen AI, getting answers to these questions would require deep searching and institutional knowledge about where things are stored. You would then also need to rely on searching, which in most organizations is a challenge. In fact, I remember watching a presentation from an M365 consultant at last year's Digital Workplace Conference who opened their keynote by declaring, searching in M365 sucks. But now with Gen AI, getting answers to these questions is now a lot easier, as we'll see in the next slide. And so hopefully these screenshots highlight the importance of information security, with confidentiality being one of the three key pillars of the 3 Cs. So there are different ways in which you could manage permissions in your organization. The first one being with identity management and general IT access control. They form the foundations. Then you need to choose how you manage information more granularly on a in a logical construct, whether that be users or teams or projects or departments or business units. And then more specifically by application level or process level. For example, should everyone be able to see contracts in draft status? And also what type of content it is. So not all people from finance need to see certain reports like financial valuations or plan investments or customer and vendor contracts. So those are some of the key kind of things to consider with permissions, because I'm aware that a lot of organizations just try and manage things by project or by team or by business unit. But when you start using things like enterprise search, it does become more apparent that we do need to consider now more deeply where that document is in its life cycle and what type of document is it within that business unit. Should they really be seeing that information? And so the challenge is this information, like we mentioned before, that's managed by a construct based on a location, which is a folder. And this is a rhetorical question. I'm not expecting any answers, but my question to everyone here is, are folders still the best way to manage permissions? And so in this example here, we want all material from clients to be protected under a dedicated NDA. So if you were using a folder structure, you would need to manually create a folder under the project folder for documents provided by client, which is that one there. And then you would get IT, whether that's internal IT or your MSP, to create a security group that links back to the folder. This would need to happen for every single project you had NDAs for. Whereas if you're managing that information with metadata, you can simply specify that client provided documents are automatically restricted to the project team only, and incoming documents can then also be linked automatically to a workflow to automate processing of incoming documents so they have the right permissions from the start. And so the thing to consider is, in your business, what permission models make sense. And lastly, let's cover the curation bit in a little bit more detail. So curation is all about making sure we're not focusing on confusing AI with unnecessary noise. So to provide the best possible answers and insights in the right context, you want to have a curated collection of information available for the generative AI application to query. So my question to everyone is, and you can input it in the Q&A if you want to, raise your hands if you've had trouble finding the latest versions of documents in your organization. Got a few raising of hands there, which is great. And if you didn't, I would challenge you to think a bit more deeply about that if you think you've got that as a problem. So my question is, right, so that's the question, right? So if we as workers cannot find or are unsure about what the latest version of a particular proposal, agreement, or document is, what chance does AI have? So let's go into detail now on what needs to be considered with the curation aspect of the 3 Cs.
Hey, Kevin, sorry, just before you go on, there's a couple of things I want to just say. People are probably thinking AI can read all the documents anyway. And the reality is it can. But it, as you said before, it is noise and it can confuse the AI and it can cause challenges to getting the right version. I had an example really quickly where I've been dealing with one of my customers. It's a large multi-billion-dollar organization, and we have to comply that we work. So we get a certificate of compliance that cybersecurity is up to date. And they said to us, "Oh, it's expired." And I said, "Well, no, it isn't. I've got the latest version here." And they, "No, I've got the latest." And so for massive, 10,000 employee firm can get that wrong. How do smaller firms deal with that? I just thought it was an interesting example of curation not actually working.
Yeah. And that's also probably because they're trying to manage all this information manually in kind of this folder structure, and they're not using automation in the best way possible to help them with that. So what we have here are just a few pop-ups that you can see, and they're kind of segmented into columns. So this first column here, these are actually data minimization strategies. These are things to consider, right? Are you making copies? Well, what happens to those copies? How do you know what version's official? Do you archive old data? And then the next column around that curation bit is things that you can actually do, and they're actually achievable if you're managing information with metadata. So things like automating of naming. So one of the customers from Advanced Business Consulting, they're a management consulting firm in Melbourne, and they used to use M365. And one of the things that they really liked when they moved over to M-Files was the fact that they could actually use the metadata to automatically name their documents. So every single document that's stored in M-Files has a consistent naming structure. Do you use templates? And do we know important document processes? So even this bit here, right? Most organizations will have some sort of manual that they'll give to a new employee that describes what the standard operating procedure is for that particular document. Most people don't read those things, sadly. And then what happens is that if you've worked in the organization for long enough, you would have like a encyclopedic knowledge of what to do next in a process. What we're trying to do is trying to automate that process so people don't even need to understand what the actual process is. All they need to know is, hey, I'm going to create the document with this template. And by creating the document from a template, we're using the right version of the template, and that it's in the right process straight away. They don't need to know what happens next. That's how we try and automate that curation element as much as possible. And then in the third column, these are achievable by automating the governance, again, with metadata, but at M-Files, we kind of call this concept knowledge work automation. So permissions driven by metadata, putting a document into a workflow, also metadata, and even connecting the documents and business data, which we showed before in the connectivity screenshots, that can also be automated as well. And so in a typical consulting firm, these are the types of documents you will need to consider regarding organization and curation. And the scenario follows the typical types of documents related to project-based work as a consulting organization. So even at the highest level, there are a lot of documents to manage, as you can see here. And that's why automating your processes as much as possible pays dividends when it comes to the curation of content to then use with generative AI.
Yeah, I can see, when you show that slide, Kevin, I can really see how that is so difficult to manage with the folder structure.
Yeah.
And you really need to think about almost like a database to store all this information.
Absolutely. Yep. And we're actually going to show you now in the next slide, even if you wanted to perform a basic function, such as reviewing all signed project agreements, why that's a challenge if you're trying to manage this in a logical kind of folder structure. Because if you can see here, these documents would typically be here, and they would be nestled away maybe in a client folder somewhere. But if your legal team just wanted to see all the contracts and NDAs, it's actually not that easy for them to do that in the kind of logical kind of saving structure.
And there's a good point you said there, Kevin. If your legal team, it's just efficiency, isn't it? Because
exactly.
We're dealing with so much more cross-functional nowadays than we were in the past.
Exactly. So think about this scenario, right? We want to review all signed project agreements. So in a typical organization, we just try and do a keyword search and hope that the file names include agreement, contract, or signed. And in this example here, we're actually just searching within Teams or SharePoint. What if you were using other systems, which is what we're talking about before, that connectivity element? It's not that easy to do. But if you're managing your information with metadata, really simple. You just say type of document, agreement, and then the workflow state, signed. do your filtered search, press enter, and all of those documents would appear straight away.
And AI would be able to use that as well.
Yeah. And that was kind of the same. That was like the problem you had with your Google search appliance, wasn't it, JP?
Yeah, far too much information. I couldn't put the context around what I needed. And I think AI is going to be challenged with that. But yet, if you can give AI the content and the context with the metadata or the tagging, I think we're on a winning platform there, Kevin.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that's I feel quite confidently about. I'm not scared about using generative AI for enterprise search because using metadata to manage it makes it a lot easier. So in your organization, you need to ask this question, how should you organize your data? So it's all curated in the best possible way. And some of the core considerations from our 3Cs, it's not just about generative AI, because the things that we're doing actually help people in your organization right now with managing information, not just generative AI. And so those are the three Cs. But before we wrap up, I'd like to share with you 3 useful materials to help your organization meet the 3 Cs to maximize your generative AI investment. And so we've got some frameworks that you can use to help you on your journey. As before you start, most of you will probably be faced with these types of questions. So I know in the 3.5 years I've been working in mFiles, we always have customers with this dilemma. They'll say, we don't know what we want, don't have the budgets, or hey, we use all these legacy systems, we couldn't possibly do that. Our leadership have no idea with what's possible, so let's just keep it as it is. Or we really want to do it, but we don't have anyone to help us drive that, and we don't have enough dedicated resources to get the change management piece to work effectively. We've implemented the latest tech before, but we have a real problem with change management and getting people to actually adopt it, or simply processes that we have. It's just what it is. It's how it has been, how it always will be. Yeah, processes are too manual and people just won't follow the rules. And so before embarking on those programs, we've got some tools that can help you evaluate your readiness holistically. And so what we've created is the Knowledge Work Automation Capability Maturity Model. And that helps organizations understand where they are on their journey to maximize the use of generative AI within your organization. The key point here is making sure that you align what the business objectives are with your information management objectives. It's not just an IT exercise. And so we've got a high-level overview here of what it looks like. We've got these kind of categories, so information strategy, governance, technology, infrastructure, level of automation, end user capabilities, and we've got the 5 different levels here. So I like to say, it's a marathon, it's not a sprint, it's not a destination, but it's a journey, and the same things ring true with this, right? So just because you're level 2 now doesn't mean you need to jump to level 5 right now. There are actually small incremental steps and improvements that you can make to get to that level 5.
Yeah, I think, Kevin, that capability or maturity models exist in many different paradigms within the IT world. Yeah. What they're really helpful for is to give you a guidance of what can be achieved. And like you said, you don't have to be at 5, but at least you know what you can get if you wanted to, and if there is a return on investment to get there.
Yep, absolutely. And so we will be sending some links to you by email after this. You'll get them from Marcello. But these 3 resources are really useful. So this is kind of a white paper that mFiles did with Forrester on this topic. It's a research paper. And then we also have an online kind of survey where you can do a self-assessment, and it gives you a kind of scorecard at the end with some recommendations on what to do next. And we also have a kind of document that describes what's in here in I guess bit simpler kind of terms as well. And so in summary, those are the 3 C's of generative AI to maximize your investment in that kind of platform. So it's connectivity, confidentiality, and curation. And hopefully you found today's presentation insightful. And if you're thinking about how to implement these elements practically, come and speak to the team and reach out to them at Advanced Business Consulting. They've been doing this for a very long time. They've helped a lot of customers. If you go on the MFiles website and you look up the case studies, you actually find quite a few case studies from customers from Advanced Business Consulting.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm not sure if, Marcello, if there's any questions anyone has. Let's have a look. I think that's. I think you've covered off quite a bit of it, Kevin. So, if anyone has any questions, like as you said, we can help them out individually, and I think that's a wrap. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thanks, everyone.
And thanks, Kevin.
Have a great morning. Cheers. See you, everyone.